Lift every voice and sing. 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 Lift every voice and sing.
Welcome to the CAAAS Conversations. I am your host, Reiland Rabaka, founder and director of the Center for African and African American Studies, which we call the CAAAS, here at the University of Colorado Boulder. Today we are joined by Dr. William Cross. William E. Cross Jr. is Professor Emeritus of Higher Education and Counseling Psychology at the University of Denver and the author of Shades of Black, Diversity and African American Identity. He's co-editor of Meaning Making, Internalized Racism and African American Identity, and he is the co-author of Dimensions of Blackness, Racial Identity, and Political Beliefs. He is the recipient of the 2022 Gold Medal Award for Lifetime Achievement in the Applications of Psychology from the American Psychological Association. I want to give a warm welcome to my big brother, my dear friend, Dr. William Cross. Welcome to the show.
Welcome. Thank you so much.
It's a great honor to have you here, Professor Cross. Let's begin. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your professional background, and your areas of expertise?
Sure. I was born in Chicago, 1940, to a large family. I had one brother and three sisters. I thought I was headed for a working class life as either working in the post office or what have you. And then the Black movement radically changed my consciousness. The next thing you know, I'm trying to be a scholar. Went to Princeton University. When I graduated with a degree in social psychology, I had become so enamored with Africana that instead of applying for a psychology position in a mainstream psychology department, I joined the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell. There, under the guidance of James Turner and others, I went from being a psychologist and becoming an Africana scholar. And I consider myself somewhat an expert in both psychology and Africana studies. And as you know, most Africana programs involve interdisciplinary approaches. So I've had to read literature, I've had to read history, in addition to psychology. And my work tends to fuse Black psychology, mainstream psychology, and Africana.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. Obviously, I'm well aware you've been working at the intersection of Africana studies, African American studies, and psychology for over 50 years. I've got to ask you, Bill, again, inquiring minds want to know, how would you define Black psychology?
Well, psychology generally covers emotions, thinking, behavior. And so because of the history of mainstream psychology, treating us as either inferior persons or people who are drenched in deficits, Black psychology is a corrective. It speaks to two audiences. It speaks back to the mainstream, but when we're successful, we try to speak to Black people themselves. And our thrust is for developing an authentic picture of our emotions, of our cognitions, and our behavior.
Wow. So Black psychology is kind of FUBU, as we say in hip hop, which means for us, by us, for
Yes.
us, by us. We're talking to us, but at the same time, you know, the African American experience is not simply us speaking to Black folk, but also us, you know, resisting, if you will, this larger superstructure that we have to navigate, that we have to work through and everything like that. So Black psychology, all right, really, really interesting. In 1971, you introduced the Négrescence model, AKA the Cross model. What is the psychology of Négrescence and what are its 5 stages?
Well, when Dr. King was murdered, as a people, we went from trying to spend much of our time trying to convince white people to move in one direction or another. But our response to King's death was to turn inward, not as withdrawal, just simply trying to flesh out the greater depths of meaning of what we meant by Blackness. And it turns out that most people started at a point where they were heavily miseducated, not necessarily psychologically damaged, but heavily miseducated with regard to their frame of reference. And King's death acted as a trigger to cause people to really take hold of themselves. So we call that beginning stage, that point in which we were not so aware, pre-encounter. And then there's an encounter, which is the trigger that causes you to gain consciousness. The middle stage, immersion, talks about the struggle between the still present old identity and the struggle to carve out the new. So they're in tension with each other. That lasts for some time. And then eventually people gravitate toward, if they move forward, they gravitate toward more comfort with the new identity. And then I added a fifth stage called internalization commitment to make the distinction between people who changed their identity and felt good with being Black, but didn't do much more with it, as opposed to others like yourself and our colleague who's assisting in the program, where you turn Blackness into action and commitment. So depending upon your skill, if you were a poet, you might have been just a poet before your consciousness, and then you become a Black poet. So in my sense, when I developed consciousness, at the time I was a psychologist, I became a Black psychologist. So in a sense, it's a way in which you galvanize your frame of reference, your identity, and it helps to, in a sense, give you meaning in life and guidance as to how you're going to make a contribution.
This is really fascinating. Bill, this is a conversation you and I have had off the record for a number of years. My beloved.
They closed down our restaurant, by the way.
Yeah, hey man, COVID-19, blame that on COVID-19. But I've often asked where you would place yourself within these 5 stages. Where are you at, Bill?
Well, I'm well beyond the middle stage. I did go through a rather dramatic middle stage with all the anger and rage that was there. And then Africana studies helped me to not so much chill, but integrate. In a sense, it helped me to show how these disparate pieces of myself could be integrated into a whole. And I'm not a perfect human being in any kind of sense. I'm still greatly flawed. But at a consciousness level, I would say that I developed a very strong consciousness in that I can integrate material across disciplines in order to make a statement about who we are, where we're going, and what we can do.
This is really fascinating. For me, it was really humbling the first time I was able to talk to you about Négrescence and the way that the way it grew out of your own life and your own experience. I don't think that enough people, get the opportunity that I do, that, I got a chance to study your work in grad school, but to be able to sit once a month and to have lunch with you, brunch, our brotherhood brunches, and to be able to talk to you about the evolution of Négrescence. Again, you created in 1971. Here it is. I'm fast forwarding to your brand new book, 2000, which came out in 2021. 50 years of you, Bill, so I can see a theoretical through line. I can see a level of consistency in your work. And it's almost as if you developing this model that grew out of your life and your struggle, but look at also how it's helped so many other people, right? Particularly with the stages. And it doesn't see us from a deficit. I think that's something I've always appreciated about your work, Dr. Cross, is that it doesn't see this sort of the culture of poverty, this Black deficit model that a lot of social scientists and a lot of social science, people are getting tenure of talking strangely.
This actually played out
about Black people.
This actually played out with the model, because if you recall, when we were turning toward a more Blackenized sense of self, whites often referred to us as rabble rousers, as people who were only filled with hate and so on. But I was seeing people, including myself, transitioning more from, and we did go through a period where we felt intensely hostile toward white society. But internalization is an interesting thing that happens. Hatred almost becomes independence. I'll give an example of James Turner. When he created the Africana Center at Cornell, he was stressing more independence than he was hostility. But he wanted the white community, Cornell community, to establish an Africana Center in which there would be tenure track positions, in which there was resources to fund the administration. He even helped to establish an Ujamaa residential college, because there were often first generation kids coming in from the inner city, and rather than throw them into the white mixture, that they would be able to almost during the day test themselves in the classroom, so to speak, and then at night be able to come something home. And so I wanted to stress in the model that this caricature of us as Black militants who were only hatred, that was not the story. And so from the very beginning, I was attacking the deficit frame of reference.
This is so powerful. For me, my relationship to Black psychology has been more about love. It has helped me relearn to love myself. So it's not, again, it's not about somebody else. It, looks inward. And I think most people don't understand that about African American studies or Africana studies or Black studies, whichever name that we use for our field. It's not about hating anybody. It's actually about us loving ourselves. And that's going to be really important after all those years of enslavement, to teach Black people how to love themselves and to relearn to love themselves and to value themselves, to begin to value ourselves in a society where often we are devalued, if you will. Let's fast forward to your current work. What led you to research and write Black identity from a barber's chair, Black identity from a barber's chair? Could you briefly tell us what the book is about? Congratulations, by the way, Bill, on your brand new book.
Thank you. How do I say this? I've been an actor in Black studies, and I had to confront the fact that I owed it to the community that before I passed on to the next level, that I make a statement that perhaps summarized some of my observations about us as a people from a psychological point of view. So in some ways, the book is a thank you to the community for allowing me to participate in Africana studies. But on a technical level, I had an agenda in which I was struggling with three kinds of dynamics that confront us. Romanticism, often in Black studies, we were accused of that. I wanted to talk about the truth without being accused of being a romantic. I wanted to deconstruct the deficit perspective based on actual research showing it was flawed from Jump Street. And in my nervousness, I'm forgetting my third point. Sorry about that.
You're all right, man.
So there's kind of a yin yang here where I'm trying to show our story without romanticizing who we are, but then presenting a very authentic presentation of the self. I also was going after this misperception of how our psychology coming out of slavery, and then in the more modern times, I try to show how social class is often confused with deficit thinking.
Good. Wow, this is really powerful. I was really struck by chapters 2 and 3. So if you don't mind, I'd like to just jump in here a little bit. Why was it important for you to revisit the Négrescence model in Black identity viewed from a barber's chair? Particularly, I'm talking about chapters 2 and 3. Yeah. And how has the psychology of Négrescence evolved from 1971 to 2021?
Well, based on our time limitation, I'll get to the point.
Okay.
We thought we were moving from being both miseducated and psychologically damaged. That was the original concept of pre-encounter. Over time, I have discovered, especially with my immersion into the gender literature, the perspective of Black feminists, that really what changed was not so much our personalities, but our belief systems, the way we made meaning of the world. Why that's so important is that if you take pre-encounter from a very strong deficit perspective, you're suggesting that our parents and our grandparents did not know how to raise us. It turns out that our humanity is shown in how our past relatives shaped our personalities. So, for example, except in this kind of situation, I'm normally very shy. So I'm the one, if I go into a social event, I'm going to get my glass of wine and kind of move over into a corner, whereas someone else is going to be very, out there. So they've shaped our personalities in a positive way over and over again. But the education system has had an effect on how we see ourselves and see our community. And miseducation is a way of short-circuiting community. Because if I don't see the community as having potential, I will tend to pull back with regard to my identity. Negrescence is almost where you're released from those kinds of things that are holding you back. And that's why, as I said, some will become Black poets, some will become Black anthropologists or Black historians. It's a releaser effect. And so I try to show to the reader how we can make this distinction between belief systems and personality. And of course, I trace that eventually back in the other chapters to slavery. Again, without romanticizing, I show how we have underestimated the extent to which the slaves were able to fashion a personality, if you will. And really, there was almost two personalities. And this is where Du Boisian's double consciousness will come in, which we'll explore in a later question.
Wow, this is so fascinating, Bill, engaging your work over the last, let's say, 25 years or so. I see a through line where you emphasize Black dignity, Black self-worth, Black self-determination, Black love, even Black joy. And so again, I think that these are the kinds of things, to me, that came to the fore. It's almost as if, compared with Shades of Black, it's foregrounded even more in your more recent book. It's definitely there.
Yeah. I'm much more direct in the barbershop text.
Yeah, and I think that even, go ahead.
That all started when I was a little boy, and my sisters would take me to get a haircut on the south side of Chicago. Yeah. And I'm up on the chair, and these dudes are coming in and out, and it's really funny. Almost someone in the barbershop knew the person's name coming in, but they give him a nickname as opposed to his real name.
Go ahead.
And it would almost lead to a little celebration as the person was coming in the door. And I remember them as sometimes amazing. There were some who did scare the shit out of me. I mean, they were pretty big.
You just cut. Come on. I'm gonna get in trouble.
Yeah, right. But I saw them sometimes as characters, but never people who were pathological. And so the book, and the title is a way of trying to say to the reader, hey, if you're up there as a little kid and these people are normal, and now as an adult, I'm actually writing about their normalcy. We have to understand that the idea of our being an abnormal people, a damaged people, I mean, it's almost the legacy of white slavery. They worked so hard to excuse their behavior toward us with the notion that we deserved it almost. So, and again, I stress this probably to the point where I'm repeating it too often. There is a way to talk about our being oppressed, and at the same time are showing almost victory in how we raised our children at the same time. And this is why Du Bois, who to me, more so than any other scholar in the past, certainly more so than Fraser, had us understand that we are people with problems, but we are not our problems. I think you said it in a better way than I have.
Hey man, I appreciate you, and you're sort of dipping into this next question. So let's go ahead and take it on. In chapters 4 and 5 of the book, you bring négrescence into dialogue with W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness and E. Franklin Fraser's contributions to deficit theories about Black people and the Black family in particular. Why was it important for you to critically engage Du Bois and Fraser? How did studying their ideas contribute to the revision of the négrescence model?
I can't tell you how many times Black students have come to me with ideas about research, and their starting point is the deficit perspective. And, I would go crazy. So in this book, I wanted to see whether or not I could show it was a perspective that never held much weight to begin with. So, for example, E. Franklin Frazier suggested that slavery damaged us psychologically and in terms of our family, and that this damage was shown by the percent of Black teenagers who would turn to crime and delinquency. So then I show that at the time that Frazier was writing, he was talking about Black folks in Chicago, and then I discovered that the population he studied was coming up from the Deep South. The school system did not want to have integrated schools. So what did they do? They tried to build schools as we came in, but they couldn't keep up. We were just flooding the city, so to speak. Yeah. So they had a policy of double shifting. Our kids were going to school for half the day. So our teenagers are spending half their time unchaperoned on the streets. Well, that's an invitation to delinquency. And I show in the book how he should have known that and should have included that in his work. Then I realized that he was also focusing on folks who were in the Northeast and the Midwest, Chicago, Detroit, what have you. But it turns out, if you study, and not many people have, the migration of Black folks from the Deep South to California, it turns out that for various reasons that are too long to explain now, but racism did not take hold as quickly as it had in the Midwest and so on. So you have families coming straight out of being sharecroppers with me, uneducated and illiterate, but their children had access to integrated quality schools. So Ralph Bunch in 1927 graduates at UCLA, top of his class, if you will, with an advanced degree. And then I focus on two examples that I find amazing. The Robinson family coming out of Georgia, again, sharecroppers, illiterate, speaking Ebonics, you with me? Okay. So then their children go to school, K through 12. One of them is the Jackie Robinson family, who goes on to integrate baseball. And another from Texas is Thomas Bradley, who would become the mayor of California. So in a sense, had Frazier studied people moving to California, he would have either had to not write his book or he would have had to add a chapter. And I point out that he does two things that makes his work so flawed. He doesn't reference Du Bois. He only he cherry picks Du Bois's work and only takes material that fits into a deficit perspective. He doesn't study how Du Bois follows Black people out of slavery. Many of them are successful within one generation, and then go on to establish schools and what have you. And we sometimes forget. Chachu Sindiata of the University of Illinois, he shows that 50 to 60 all Black towns were created immediately after slavery. Psychologically, you can't do that without having agency, without having strong personality and so on. So I almost start with the proof of adults 10 years out of slavery succeeding. And then I say to the reader, look, they spent their childhood in slavery. So there's no way that they could be strong adults without having been raised a certain way as children in slavery by who? By slaves. And as it turns out, and there's historical evidence now to show that just Du Bois would call it double consciousness. The slaves were almost talking about enveloping in children two personalities. Wow. One they would exhibit to the owners of the plantations, and the other they would keep hidden. Emancipation allowed for the expression of the hidden personality. Now, some people will say, look, how can you be a slave and not be damaged? Well, it turns out if you have a strong personality as a child, you with me? And then you end up experiencing horror as an adult. The stronger your personality, the more you can negotiate that horror show. So simply being a slave does not mean you're going to end up being damaged. Because if the way we were raised as a people, by community, it allowed us to have enough strength that even to get through goddamn slavery and then to succeed when we had freedom. Most of the lynchings that occur after 1876 occur, not because we're raping white women and so on, but we were successful, scared the absolute crap out of white people. And in a sense, the only way they could stop our progress is through lynchings and horror shows.
Wow. This speaks to Tulsa, Black Wall Street, and all of that. So we have so many instances of this, for the sake of time. Let's go on to the next question. I really appreciate that response, Bill, because you show that even during a dehumanizing period in African-American history, like African-American enslavement, our ancestors were literally rehumanizing, like fighting and affirming and asserting their humanity, even in the face of the most dehumanizing conditions. And that's a special kind of humanity in and of itself. And that's what Black studies is about. That's what African-American studies is about, which is why, again, it's not about it. Sometimes they will recenter whiteness when we start talking about Black studies. No, we're talking about Black people. This isn't about hating white people. It's actually about learning to love Black people on our own terms. And that on our own terms part, that's what's so important.
Yeah, and when one of the objectives of my book is that if you can't show that we're full of deficits, then what the hell is going on? And then part of my book in chapters 4 and 5 is social class, and the way in which, if you are poor, I remind the reader that crime and poverty are connected. And I don't use the Black experience, I use ethnic white experience. So when Jews, when the Irish, when Italians first arrived in the United States and they were just poor, it's just no accident that from their first phase of assimilation, crime is there. I mean, it's funny how we romanticize the Italian crime picture. So today, with the pandemic and with the closing down of factories, many of our brothers and sisters who in the 50s were holding down jobs, owning houses, had fancy cars or whatever. That would be my brother-in-law who taught me. When that disappears, then the streets become our playground for economic success. And we're simply repeating what has happened to white ethnic groups. But there's a way in which history is told so that there's a disconnect between our behavior and the behavior in the past. So I spent a lot of time in the book trying to remind the reader of the power of social class to take ordinary, average Black men and women, and it almost forces them to turn to the streets, and then they become easy fodder for the criminal justice system. It's not as my friend Yasser Payne would say, the brothers and sisters on the streets are average, normal dudes and sisters caught in a Faustian dilemma. And it turns out that when you turn to the streets, there's so much observation on the part of the police and authorities that it makes it easier for them to capture us in a certain way. And that I would consider that one of my most driving forces for writing the book, is to try to reintroduce social class into our discourse, not as a way of whitenizing our discovery, but to show how you can't avoid the pitfalls and the strengths of capitalism in explaining our behavior.
Man, what you just said makes me think of Manning Marable's How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. It also, this is where your work has influenced me in terms of my work in hip hop studies. You know, when some people, I understand the misogyny and the queerphobia and the transphobia of gangster rap music, but there's another sociological lens there as well as to why they're forced into the quote unquote underground economy. Well, if you got a record and you can't get a job in mainstream society, they've created their own jobs. And these are instances where Black folk are humanizing themselves on their own terms, right? And they're working out their own way to survive in this world. I know we're running out of time. Let me hit you with the last question, Bill. You end the book.
Let me just do one quick thing.
Go ahead, let's have a conversation, baby.
Between 1940, which would be World War II, and up to about 1955, Black gangs are not an issue in the social sciences. Why is that? Because we were employed in these factories that were started up, you know, God bless Harry Truman, not Abraham Lincoln, but he and Roosevelt made it possible for us to get a foothold on these factory jobs. And when our sisters were working, and our wives were working too, we ended up with a pretty healthy, almost middle-class life from a materialistic way of speaking. The bottom falls out of that with deindustrialization in the late 50s and early 60s. And we see that in the white community. They're dying by the dozens every day because they're no longer connected. They no longer have health care. We just simply have not really absorbed the power of deindustrialization to ruin the lives of Black and white working class people.
Wow. All right. So last question. You end the book with a chapter on slavery, trauma, and resilience.
Yeah.
You argue that it is important for us to see Black people as normal people living through abnormal human conditions. In a sense, you build on Du Bois's declaration in The Souls of Black Folk that Black people should not be collapsed into their problems. We are not a problem people, but a people with problems, just like any other human group.
Yeah.
Why is it important for us to see Black people as normal? Why is it important to acknowledge slavery and racial trauma, but at the same time acknowledge past and present Black resilience? And what impact does acknowledging Black resilience have on Black mental health and wellness?
It means that you start the discussion not from the point of view of pathology. When you ask the question, by normal people, I mean the distribution of flaws and strengths in our communities is the same as for other groups.
Okay.
It's a humanist position. So what would human beings do in this position? And it causes us to better understand how in the Holocaust, Jews valued instruments, musical instruments. They often played those instruments in the context of death. That's phenomenal strength. We know that the Korean women who were used as prostitutes, they now have been able to tell their story. Well, it's the same with us. Normal people caught in slavery, caught in racial segregation, struggling, if you will, and there was no victory. And the only victory that occurs in the white communities is when they absolutely killed us. They had to shoot us, lynch us, and so on. But once you get past that, you find normal people living their lives, marrying, having children, and trying their best to negotiate an oppressive community. And that was my goal, is to say, quit talking about our deficits, talk about our strengths, and then show how the system doesn't authenticate those strengths. So my father could have been whoever. He ended up being a Pullman porter, but he could have been more. He wasn't more because of some flaw that he had in himself. It was, in a sense, the system pushing back and not recognizing his normalcy.
Wow, Bill. Now the whole world will see I'm not making it up when I talk about the conversations, the high quality conversation that we have. I want to end by thanking you, my dear Dr. Cross, for blessing us with your wisdom once again. I want to congratulate you on your fabulous brand new book. Thank you for the signed copy, brother. I want to congratulate you on your brand new book. It is certainly like a sequel to Shades of Black, and you just took it to a whole nother level.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about my book.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I love you so much.
Hey, man, I love you so much as well, brother. This has been a beautiful conversation. I'm glad that we get a chance to sort of put this out there. Well, here we go. I'm Reiland Rabaka, and I thank you for watching the CAAAS Conversations. Remember, everybody has a special contribution to make to the cause.
Lift every voice and sing. Lift every voice and sing. Lift every voice.